Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. The Phoenix of Chemos. In the dark abyss between stars, where the warp churns with ancient malice, a single capsule tumbled through the void. Inside lay an infant, perfect and unblemished, one of 20 sons stolen from their father before they could know his light. The ruinous powers, those entities of pure chaos that dwell beyond the veil of reality, had scattered these precious children across the galaxy in an act of cosmic spite. Each pod carried a future that might have been, a destiny interrupted. And so it was that Fulgrim's capsule, trailing fire and cosmic debris, plummeted towards the grey, dying world of Chemos. The impact site was unremarkable, nestled amongst the countless industrial warrens that scarred Chemos' surface. This was a world of ash and toil, where every resource had been extracted, every vein of ore stripped bare by generations of desperate mining. The people of Chemos clung to existence in vast underground facilities, breathing recycled air and subsisting on what little their exhausted planet could provide. Into this bleak landscape came the Primarch, though none yet knew what he truly was. When the miners discovered the child within the crashed pod, tradition dictated a grim fate. Chemos was a world of scarcity, where every mouth to feed represented a burden the fragile colony could scarcely bear. Orphans, those children without family units to support them, were typically executed as an act of cold practicality. Resources were too precious to waste on those who could not contribute, who had no place in the intricate web of survival that bound Chemosian society together. Yet as they looked upon the infant Fulgrim, the miners found themselves unable to follow protocol. There was something about the child that defied explanation. His features possessed an otherworldly perfection, an aesthetic quality that seemed to transcend mere human beauty. Even as a newborn, there was a symmetry to his face, a luminous quality to his pale skin, that struck the hardened miners silent. Where they had come prepared to perform a mercy killing, they instead found themselves captivated. This unnatural beauty, this inexplicable radiance, saved Fulgrim's life. The miners took him in, passing him amongst the family units, each claiming temporary guardianship of this strange, beautiful child. As Fulgrim grew, it became apparent that his beauty was merely the most obvious of his extraordinary gifts. By the age of 10, when most Chemosian children were still learning basic maintenance protocols, Fulgrim had already mastered the entirety of the colony's mining technology. He absorbed knowledge with a rapidity that astounded his tutors, understanding complex engineering principles after a single explanation, seeing connections and possibilities that eluded even the most experienced technicians. His mind worked on a level that seemed to operate beyond normal human cognition, processing information and synthesizing solutions with preternatural speed. It was not enough for Fulgrim to simply understand the technology that sustained Chemos. He saw its flaws, its inefficiencies, the countless small failures of design that had accumulated over generations of barely adequate maintenance. The vapor extractors, those vital machines that drew precious moisture from the thin atmosphere, operated at a fraction of their theoretical capacity. Most Chemosians accepted this as an immutable fact, the natural degradation that came with age and overuse. Fulgrim saw only opportunity. Working in secret at first, driven by an innate need for perfection, he completely redesigned the vapor extractor systems. The results were nothing short of miraculous. When Fulgrim's modifications were implemented across the colony network, water production tripled virtually overnight. What had been a constant source of anxiety, the slow decline of moisture extraction that promised eventual catastrophe, was reversed in a matter of months. The young Primarch had not merely repaired old systems but had fundamentally improved upon designs that had remained unchanged for centuries. This was Fulgrim's first true gift to his adopted world, and it would not be his last. Emboldened by this success, Fulgrim turned his attention to the broader challenges facing Chemosian industry. He developed what would come to be known as the Phoenix cycle production method, a revolutionary approach to manufacturing that maximized efficiency whilst minimizing waste. The method took its name from the ancient Terran myth of the Phoenix, that immortal bird which died in flame only to rise renewed from its own ashes. Similarly, the Phoenix cycle ensured that nothing was ever truly wasted, that every byproduct fed back into the production chain, that failure itself became fuel for rebirth and improvement. The implementation of the Phoenix cycle required more than mere technical innovation. It demanded a complete reorganization of Chemosian labor and society. To this end, Fulgrim established the Guild of the Phoenix, a new administrative body that would oversee the transformation of Chemos' industrial base. The Guild was structured according to principles of merit and excellence, where advancement came through demonstrated skill rather than hereditary privilege or seniority. It was a radical departure from the rigid hierarchies that had previously governed Chemosian society, and it marked the beginning of Fulgrim's vision for a better world. As the Guild of the Phoenix grew in size and influence, Fulgrim created the Phoenix Conclaves, regular gatherings where workers, engineers, and administrators could share knowledge and debate improvements. These conclaves became crucibles of innovation, where ideas were tested against rigorous standards and the pursuit of perfection was elevated to something approaching a philosophy. Fulgrim himself attended every conclave, always seeking to learn, always pushing his people towards greater achievements. Under his guidance, Chemos began to change, not merely surviving but beginning, slowly, to thrive. Yet Fulgrim understood that humanity required more than efficient production and adequate resources. The soul needed nourishment just as surely as the body. For too long, the people of Chemos had known only labor and privation, their existence reduced to mere survival. Fulgrim determined to give them something more, something beautiful. He organized the first festival of Chemos, a celebration that would honor both the world's rebirth and the human spirit that had endured through centuries of hardship. The festival incorporated music, art, and performance, disciplines that had nearly died on Chemos but which Fulgrim now revived with passionate intensity. To provide a venue worthy of these cultural celebrations, Fulgrim performed a feat of engineering that would have seemed impossible mere years before. He calibrated the ancient orbital mirrors, massive structures left over from Chemos' distant past when the world had been verdant and prosperous. These mirrors, long dormant and assumed to be beyond repair, were restored to function under Fulgrim's direction. He aligned them to create perfect lighting for grand theaters constructed on the planet's surface, transforming bleak industrial spaces into magnificent venues where the arts could flourish once more. As Chemos' culture reawakened, Fulgrim turned his attention to preserving what remained of its historical legacy. Much had been lost during the long decline, but fragments survived, scattered throughout the various family archives and ancient data repositories. Fulgrim gathered all of Chemos' surviving literature, every poem, story, and historical record that could be recovered, and catalogued them in a place he named the Sanctum Imperialis. He could not have known how prophetic that name would prove, how soon the Imperium itself would arrive to claim him. In quieter moments, between grand projects and sweeping reforms, Fulgrim engaged in more personal acts of creation. He sculpted portraits of his aging adoptive parents, those miners who had first found him and chosen mercy over protocol. These sculptures were masterworks, capturing not merely physical likeness but something deeper, the essential character of his subjects rendered in imperishable stone. It was typical of Fulgrim that even in private endeavors, even in simple acts of filial devotion, he could not help but create something perfect, something that would endure. As Chemos transformed under his guidance, Fulgrim designed a new symbol for his world, a phoenix rising from flames rendered in purple and gold. This design would become the flag of Chemos, but its significance would extend far beyond a single planet. The phoenix would become the heraldry of a legion, the mark of warriors who strove always for perfection, who rose from every setback more determined than before. Though Fulgrim did not yet know it, this symbol would be carried across the stars, emblazoned on armor and banners in 1,000 battles yet to come. Through all these achievements, through the industrial miracle he had wrought and the cultural renaissance he had sparked, Fulgrim became more than a leader to the people of Chemos. He became their savior, the one who had delivered them from certain doom and shown them a path to genuine prosperity. They looked upon him with something approaching worship, though Fulgrim himself never encouraged such adulation. He saw his works as merely the beginning, as steps on a longer journey towards true perfection that stretched beyond the horizon. It was the people themselves who bestowed upon him the title that would echo through history. They called him the Phoenician, one who rises from failure, one who transforms ashes into glory. The name captured something essential about Fulgrim's nature, his refusal to accept defeat, his belief that from any ruin something better could be built. Chemos had been a failure, a dying world clinging to the edge of extinction. Fulgrim had risen from that failure and lifted an entire civilization with him. He was, in every sense, the Phoenician. And then, one day, the Emperor arrived. The master of mankind came to Chemos aboard a vessel of such magnificence that it seemed to dwarf the world itself. He came seeking his lost son, guided by psychic senses that transcended normal human understanding, drawn to the beacon of Fulgrim's soul like a moth to flame. When the Emperor descended to Chemos' surface, it was Fulgrim who stood waiting to receive him, somehow knowing, with that preternatural awareness that marked all the Primarchs, that his true father had come at last. Fulgrim knelt instantly. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt or pride. Where some of his brothers had met the Emperor with suspicion or challenged him to prove his worth, Fulgrim simply knelt. He recognized immediately what stood before him, recognized in the Emperor's perfection a mirror of his own nature magnified 1,000-fold. Here was the source, the template from which he had been crafted, and Fulgrim's response was instant and complete submission. It was a moment that defined him, that revealed the core of his character, the desire to serve something greater, to be part of a grander perfection. The Emperor had not come alone. He brought word of an imperium spanning the stars, of a great crusade to reunite humanity, and of a legion that waited for its Primarch. The Third Legion, the Emperor's children as they would come to be known, had suffered grievously during the campaigns on Terra and in the early years of the Great Crusade. A flaw in their gene seed, a mutation that struck randomly and without mercy, had reduced their numbers to a mere handful. Where other legions boasted tens of thousands of warriors, the Third Legion could field barely 200. They were the smallest, the most depleted, hovering on the edge of extinction. Fulgrim took command of this remnant with a mixture of pride and determination. These warriors, few though they were, carried his genetic legacy. They were extensions of himself, and he would not allow them to fade into obscurity. He looked upon the scarred, weathered faces of his sons and saw not weakness but potential, not failure but the raw material of future glory. The Third Legion had been broken, but Fulgrim was the Phoenician, the one who rose from failure. He vowed, with every fiber of his being, to rebuild them into something worthy of their name. The Emperor's children would not merely survive, they would excel. They would become a legion that embodied perfection in every aspect of warfare, culture, and brotherhood. Fulgrim would accept nothing less, for he had not saved Chemos from death only to watch his own sons languish in mediocrity. The phoenix would rise once more, and this time it would rise amongst the stars. The Emperor's children ascend. Of all the legions that marched beneath the Emperor's banner, only one bore a privilege so singular, so unprecedented, that it spoke to the esteem in which they were held. The Third Legion, the Emperor's children, stood alone amongst their brethren in being granted the right to display the Palatine aquila upon their armor. This was the personal heraldry of the Emperor himself, the twin-headed eagle that symbolized the unity of all mankind, and its bestowal was an honor without parallel. Where other legions wore their own symbols and colors, the Emperor's children bore the mark of the Master of Mankind directly upon their breastplates, a constant reminder of the trust and expectation placed upon them. For Fulgrim, this honor manifested in a deeply personal way. Upon his own pale flesh, inked in sacred pigments and applied with reverent precision, the Palatine Aquila was tattooed across the broad expanse of his back. The design was a masterwork, every feather of the twin eagles rendered with such detail that they seemed ready to take flight from his skin. It was a mark of distinction that Fulgrim wore with immense pride, and in quieter moments, when he stood before mirrors in his private chambers, he would contemplate the symbol and the weight of responsibility it represented. He was not merely a Primarch, not merely a general of the Imperium. He was the Emperor's chosen, marked as such for all to see. The colors that the Legion adopted as their own came not from ancient terror or from the Emperor's decree, but from Fulgrim's own past. The rich purple that adorned their armor was taken from the Chemosian cloak he had worn during his years as that world's savior, a simple garment that had been his constant companion through countless reforms and celebrations. By incorporating this hue into the Legion's livery, Fulgrim ensured that his sons would forever carry a piece of Chemos with them, a reminder that perfection could be achieved even from the most unpromising beginnings. The purple became iconic, instantly recognizable across the battlefields of the Great Crusade. The Third Legion's reverence for their genetic legacy bordered on the sacred. Every battle brother who fell was honored through the ritual interment of their gene seed, a solemn ceremony that treated these precious organs as holy relics. Given the Legion's perilously small numbers in those early years, every sample of gene seed was invaluable, representing not merely genetic material but the potential for future sons, future warriors who would carry on the quest for perfection. The fallen were laid to rest with full honors, their gene seed removed with ceremonial care and preserved in stasis, awaiting the day when it could give rise to new life, new warriors who would continue the legacy. The recruitment practices of the Emperor's children reflected Fulgrim's belief that excellence could be found in those already accustomed to high standards. The Legion recruited heavily from the Europan nobility, those scions of ancient bloodlines who had been raised amidst Terra's grandest traditions of art, philosophy, and martial prowess. Europa had preserved much of old Earth's cultural heritage through the Age of Strife, and its aristocratic houses maintained standards of education and refinement that aligned perfectly with Fulgrim's vision. These young nobles brought with them not merely physical potential but an ingrained appreciation for beauty and excellence that would become fundamental to the Legion's character. Advancement within the Emperor's children was governed by the flawless oath promotion ritual, a ceremony that demanded absolute perfection from any who sought higher rank. An aspirant for promotion would swear before their brethren to execute their duties without a single flaw, without the slightest deviation from the ideal. This oath was not mere words but a binding commitment, monitored and assessed through the most rigorous standards. Those who succeeded in maintaining their flawless performance were elevated with great ceremony. Those who failed, even in the smallest detail, remained at their current rank until they could prove themselves worthy. It was a system that ensured only the truly exceptional rose through the Legion's hierarchy. The rites of the Marbled Hall represented one of the Legion's most distinctive traditions. Within the grandest chamber of their flagship, walls lined with veined marble transported at great expense from Terra itself, the Emperor's children would gather to witness the elevation of their brothers to new ranks and positions. The chamber was a wonder of architecture, its acoustics perfect, its proportions geometrically ideal, creating a space where every word spoken carried with crystalline clarity. Here, amidst beauty and solemnity, the Legion renewed its commitment to perfection with each ceremony, each oath sworn before the assembled brotherhood. After every engagement, no matter how minor, the Emperor's children conducted perfection protocols, exhaustive post-battle assessments that analyzed every aspect of their performance. These sessions could last for hours, with officers and Astartes alike reviewing tactical decisions, examining weapon deployment, assessing formation discipline, and identifying even the smallest opportunities for improvement. Nothing was too insignificant to escape scrutiny. A bolter round that missed its intended target by millimeters, a vox communication that arrived seconds later than optimal, a blade strike that lacked perfect form, all were noted, discussed, and addressed. Through these relentless reviews, the Legion refined itself continuously. The insights gained from countless perfection protocols were codified in the Codex of Flawless Engagements, a growing compendium of tactical and strategic perfection. This was not merely a collection of successful battle plans but a comprehensive guide to ideal warfare, detailing the precise methods by which various enemy types should be engaged, the optimal deployment of different unit configurations, the perfect timing of orbital bombardments and ground assaults. The Codex was constantly updated, constantly refined, as new data from each campaign was incorporated. It became a sacred text for the Legion, studied with the same reverence that other legions might give to histories of their Primarch's deeds. Even in the brutal business of warfare, the Emperor's children sought to impose aesthetic principles. They developed the concept of aesthetic kill zones, battlefield geometries that were not only tactically sound but visually harmonious. Their deployment patterns formed pleasing shapes when viewed from above, their firing lines intersected at angles that satisfied mathematical ideals of proportion. This was not mere vanity but a demonstration that perfection could exist even in destruction, that beauty and lethality were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of a unified whole. Their enemies died amidst arrangements that would have pleased the greatest architects of ancient terror. The Legion vessels that carried the Emperor's children across the stars were themselves works of art. Unlike the purely functional warships favored by some legions, each ship in the 3rd Legion fleet bore unique frescoes adorning their hulls and interior spaces. These vast murals depicted the Legion's greatest victories, celebrated individual heroes, and illustrated philosophical concepts through allegorical imagery. Serfs and Astartes alike took pride in maintaining and adding to these decorations, ensuring that the ships were not merely instruments of war but floating galleries that proclaimed the Legion's achievements and aspirations to all who beheld them. In pursuit of physical perfection, the Legion's apothecarian developed what they termed perfection serums, enhancement compounds that went beyond the standard genetic modifications of the Astartes transformation. These serums were designed to optimize reaction times, enhance sensory acuity, and improve muscle response to levels that pushed even transhuman physiology to new extremes. The formulations were carefully calibrated, tested rigorously before deployment, and administered only to those whose performance records suggested they could benefit from such enhancement. The serums were controversial amongst some of the other legions, seen as an unnecessary modification of the Emperor's design, but Fulgrim saw them as simply another tool in the pursuit of excellence. The Phoenix Guard was established as Fulgrim's personal retinue, an elite formation drawn from the very finest warriors the Legion could offer. These were not merely skilled fighters but paragons of the Legion's ideals, warriors who embodied perfection in combat, bearing, and character. Each member of the Phoenix Guard had proven themselves through decades of flawless service, had sworn the most sacred oaths, and had demonstrated absolute loyalty to both their Primarch and the Legion's creed. They wore distinctive plumes and bore mastercrafted weapons, and their presence at Fulgrim's side was both a practical necessity and a symbol of the standards to which all Emperor's children aspired. Fulgrim's own armor was a marvel designated the Gilded Panoply, a suit of artificer plate that represented the pinnacle of the Imperium's armoring craft. Every surface was worked with intricate designs, inlaid with precious metals, and adorned with gemstones that caught the light with each movement. Yet for all its beauty, the armor was supremely functional, incorporating the most advanced protection systems and servo motors available. The gilded panoply was proof that form and function need not be separate, that an object could be simultaneously the deadliest weapon and the most exquisite work of art. When Fulgrim strode onto a battlefield in this magnificent armor, he was a vision that inspired his sons and struck terror into his enemies. For rapid deployment and atmospheric operations, Fulgrim utilized a personal Thunderhawk designated flawless execution. This gunship had been modified extensively from standard patterns, its engines tuned to produce not merely thrust but a harmonic resonance that was almost musical, its weapon systems calibrated to microsecond precision. The hull was decorated with the same care as the Legion's larger vessels, bearing imagery of the Phoenix and scenes from Fulgrim's life on Chemos. To fly aboard flawless execution was considered a great honor amongst the Legion, and its pilots were selected from only the most skilled serfs in the fleet. Among Fulgrim's personal weapons, one held particular significance. Firebrand was a Volkite pistol of ancient provenance, its mechanisms dating back to the earliest days of the Imperium's expansion. Volkite weapons, with their distinctive heat ray beams that caused targets to deflagrate in spectacular fashion, were becoming rare by the time of the Great Crusade, their complex construction difficult to replicate. Firebrand was a masterpiece of such technology, perfectly maintained and enhanced through the skill of the Legion's finest artificers. Fulgrim wielded it with casual grace, and many a foe discovered too late that the beautiful weapon in the Primarch's hand was no mere ornament. As the Great Crusade swept across the galaxy, the Emperor's children established a record that would become legendary. Under Fulgrim's command, they achieved a 100% compliance rate in every sector they were assigned. This was an accomplishment unmatched by any other legion, a testament to their combination of martial excellence, diplomatic skill, and unwavering determination. Some worlds welcomed the Imperium after witnessing the perfection with which the Third Legion conducted themselves. Others resisted and were crushed with such overwhelming efficiency that nearby systems capitulated without a shot being fired. Whatever the circumstances, the result was always the same: compliance, complete and total. The Battle of the Ion demonstrated Fulgrim's prowess as a warrior in the most visceral terms. The world had been dominated by the Xenos warlord Zenat Salithian, a creature of immense size and savage cunning that had enslaved the human population for generations. When diplomacy inevitably failed, Fulgrim led the assault personally, cutting through the alien's bodyguard with contemptuous ease. The duel between Primarch and Xenos warlord was brief but spectacular. Zenat Salithian, for all its alien might and exotic weaponry, simply could not match Fulgrim's speed and precision. The Primarch's blade sang through the air in a perfect arc, and the warlord's head tumbled from its shoulders, its expression still locked in disbelief. The human slaves were freed, and the Ion joined the Imperium. Against the greenskin menace, Fulgrim proved equally formidable. The Orc warboss Gorzad had carved out a small empire in the subsector, his war threatening several compliant worlds. Fulgrim challenged the massive alien to single combat, a gesture that the Orc, driven by its primitive warrior culture, could not refuse. The duel was vastly different from the measured precision of the Ion. Gorzad fought with raw, overwhelming power, each blow capable of shattering ceramite. But Fulgrim was like water flowing around stone, never where the Orc expected, his blade finding the gaps in the crude armor with surgical accuracy. When Gorzad finally fell, Fulgrim had not taken a single blow in return, his armor unmarked, his breathing barely elevated. It was a masterclass in martial perfection. The campaign against the Rud presented challenges of an entirely different nature. These temporal parasites, creatures that existed partially out of phase with normal time, could not be defeated through conventional warfare alone. Fulgrim demonstrated the breadth of his capabilities by engaging in careful negotiation, bartering for chronal disruptors that would allow the Imperium to combat the Rud's temporal advantages. The discussions were complex, conducted through intermediaries and arcane protocols, but Fulgrim's patience and insight eventually secured the technology needed. It was a reminder that perfection in warfare encompassed more than mere combat prowess. The Diasporex incident revealed perhaps a more troubling aspect of the Legion's character. These human nomads, who had rejected the Imperium's call to unity and instead lived amongst aliens in a bizarre fleet-based civilization, were engaged and defeated. Rather than simple extermination, Fulgrim ordered that certain captives be taken and subjected to intensive re-education. These unfortunate souls were transformed into what the Legion termed honorary perfectionists, broken and rebuilt according to the Emperor's children's exacting standards. It was a demonstration that compliance could be achieved not merely through conquest but through the complete remaking of the recalcitrant. Whether this was mercy or a fate worse than death remained a matter of quiet debate even within the Legion. Victory, when it came, was celebrated with appropriate grandeur. The Emperor's children composed victory cantatas, elaborate musical pieces that chronicled their triumphs and were performed by servo-skulls programmed with perfect pitch and timing. These flying automatons, crafted from the remains of honored servants, would fill the air with harmonies that transformed the aftermath of battle into something approaching a religious experience. The cantatas served multiple purposes. They honored the fallen, celebrated the victorious, and reinforced the Legion's cultural identity. To hear a victory cantata echoing through the corridors of a conquered fortress was to understand that the Emperor's children were unlike any other force in the galaxy. One of the Legion's remembrances, a poet embedded with the fleet, composed an epic work titled Perfection Through Trial. This lengthy poem traced the Legion's journey from near extinction to glory, drawing parallels between Fulgrim's trials on Chemos and the Legion's own struggles. It became immensely popular among the Emperor's children, memorized and recited by warriors during long voyages between stars. The poem articulated something fundamental about the Legion's character, that perfection was not a destination but a process, that struggle itself was the crucible in which true excellence was forged. Fulgrim himself was said to have wept upon first hearing it performed in its entirety. Yet for all the Legion's achievements, Fulgrim understood that even a Primarch could benefit from brotherhood. His campaigns frequently brought him into contact with the War Master-to-be, whose 16th Legion often operated in adjacent sectors. The two Primarchs discovered a natural affinity, their tactical styles complementing each other beautifully. Where Horus was charismatic and politically astute, Fulgrim brought aesthetic refinement and uncompromising standards. They campaigned together across numerous worlds, their combined forces achieving victories that neither could have managed alone. More importantly, a close bond formed between them, a friendship that would prove to have fateful consequences in years to come. But it was with Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, that Fulgrim forged his deepest connection. Despite their surface differences, Ferrus's emphasis on strength and technological prowess versus Fulgrim's pursuit of aesthetic perfection, the two Primarchs found in each other something like a kindred spirit. They were both craftsmen at heart, both appreciated the intersection of form and function, both drove their legions to ever greater heights of achievement. Their friendship would become one of the most celebrated bonds between the Primarchs, spoken of in the same breath as the brotherhood between Horus and Sanguinius. The forge exchange between Fulgrim and Ferrus became the stuff of legend. Each Primarch crafted a weapon for the other, pouring months of labor and all their considerable skill into the creation. Ferrus forged Fireblade, a magnificent sword whose blade shimmered with an inner light, its edge so perfect it could cut through ceramite as though it were parchment. Fulgrim, in turn, created Forgebreaker, a mighty thunder hammer whose head was worked with intricate designs that somehow enhanced rather than diminished its devastating power. The exchange ceremony was conducted with great solemnity, each Primarch presenting his gift and acknowledging the skill of his brother. These weapons would become inseparable from their wielders, symbols of the bond between two of the Emperor's greatest sons. The debates between Fulgrim and Ferrus could stretch for months, conducted during rare moments when their campaigns brought them into proximity. They would argue the merits of art versus function, whether beauty should be pursued for its own sake or must always serve a practical purpose. Ferrus maintained that the highest art lay in perfect functionality, that a weapon's beauty came from its ability to kill efficiently. Fulgrim countered that functionality without aesthetic consideration was mere brutality, that true perfection required both aspects to be in harmony. Neither convinced the other, but the debates sharpened both their philosophies and deepened their mutual respect. In a gesture of particular personal significance, Fulgrim gifted Ferrus a set of feathered Chemosian wings, ceremonial items crafted from the plumage of rare birds that had been reintroduced to his homeworld during its renaissance. The wings were worked with precious metals and gems, a stunning piece of artistry that Ferrus accepted with genuine appreciation despite his general disinterest in ornamentation. He displayed them prominently in his personal quarters, a concession to beauty that surprised his own sons and spoke volumes about his regard for Fulgrim. Fulgrim commissioned a statue of Ferrus, a monumental work that was placed in a position of honor aboard the Legion's flagship. The statue depicted the Gorgon in his full armor, hammer raised, a figure of implacable strength and determination. Yet Fulgrim's artistry ensured that the statue conveyed more than mere physical presence. There was nobility in the set of the shoulders, wisdom in the stern features, and an almost paternal quality to the figure's bearing. It was Fulgrim's tribute to his brother, crafted with all the skill at his command, and it stood as a reminder to every emperor's child that strength and beauty could exist in perfect harmony. It was Fulgrim who began calling Ferrus the Gorgon, a nickname that referenced both the living metal that encased his hands and the mythological creature of ancient terror. The name stuck, spreading beyond the two legions to become Ferrus's most common epithet across the Imperium. Ferrus himself seemed amused by it, accepting the nickname with the same gruff tolerance he showed towards most of Fulgrim's more flamboyant gestures. It was another thread in the tapestry of their friendship, a small intimacy that spoke to how well they knew each other. With Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels, Fulgrim shared a mutual admiration based on their shared appreciation for beauty and culture. Both their legions valued artistry alongside martial prowess. Both Primarchs understood that the Great Crusade was about more than mere conquest. They exchanged poetry and philosophical treatises, discussed the finer points of painting and sculpture, and found in each other a refuge from brothers who could not understand why such things mattered. Their meetings were always cordial, marked by genuine warmth and respect, though they never achieved the depth of friendship that Fulgrim shared with Ferrus or Horus. The relationship with Perturabo, Lord of the Iron Warriors, was more complex. Both Primarchs were perfectionists, both drove their legions to extremes of achievement, but their approaches differed fundamentally. Where Fulgrim sought beauty in perfection, Perturabo pursued it through brutal efficiency and mathematical precision. A friendly rivalry developed, each Primarch subtly competing to demonstrate the superiority of his methods. They would compare casualty ratios, compliance speeds, and the longevity of the governments they established. It was competition without genuine animosity, though Perturabo's notorious touchiness sometimes threatened to turn it into something darker. Fulgrim's diplomatic skills extended beyond his fellow Primarchs. When circumstances required engagement with the Jagatai Khan, the enigmatic Lord of the White Scars, Fulgrim presented him with a gift of exquisite craftsmanship, a sword forged in the Chemosian style, its blade damascened with patterns that resembled the windswept steppes of Chigoris. The Khan accepted the gift with his characteristic inscrutability, though he was later seen wearing the blade. It was a small gesture that nonetheless demonstrated Fulgrim's understanding that different brothers required different approaches. Perhaps most remarkably, Fulgrim engaged in negotiations with Eldrad Ulfrin, the Farseer of Craftworld Ulthwi. The circumstances of this meeting remain shrouded in mystery and conflicting reports, but it is known that Fulgrim met with the alien Psyker and engaged in discussions that touched upon the nature of chaos, the warp, and the future of the galaxy. What Eldrad told him, what warnings the ancient Eldar might have given, were never fully disclosed. Fulgrim emerged from the encounter thoughtful but ultimately unchanged in his convictions. He had listened to the aliens' words but found them wanting compared to his own vision of perfection and the Emperor's grand design. When Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand, attempted to impose oversight on the Emperor's children's operations, Fulgrim rejected it outright. He did so with diplomatic language and impeccable courtesy, but the rejection was absolute. The Third Legion had proven themselves time and again, had achieved what no other legion could claim, and Fulgrim would not accept interference in how he commanded his sons. Malkador, wisely, did not press the issue. The Emperor's children would continue to operate with the autonomy that their record of success had earned them. And so Fulgrim stood at the absolute peak of his power and prestige. He was brilliant beyond measure, his tactical acumen matched by few and exceeded by none. He was cultured, a true Renaissance figure who could discourse on philosophy and art with the same mastery he brought to warfare. He was proud, yes, perhaps too proud, but what Primarch was not? He had saved a dying world, rebuilt a shattered legion, and carved a legend across the stars. The Emperor's children were the smallest legion numerically, but they were undeniably among the greatest. Fulgrim had achieved what the Phoenician always achieved. He had risen from ashes to glory. And there, at that pinnacle, with the galaxy seemingly at his feet and perfection within his grasp, the true test was yet to come. Laren, the first crack. The Laren system should have been just another compliance, another world brought into the imperial fold through the superior strength and enlightenment of humanity. The xeno-species that inhabited it, the Lair, were a technologically advanced serpentine race that had mastered genetic manipulation and biological enhancement to a degree that rivaled even the Imperium's finest achievements. They had sculpted their entire civilization around the pursuit of physical and sensory perfection, creating a society where every individual was a work of living art, optimized for beauty, pleasure, and capability. In another context, Fulgrim might have paused to consider the parallels between the Lair's philosophy and his own legion's creed. But he did not pause. He did not consider. The cleansing of Laren began with swift and terrible purpose. When the initial diplomatic overtures were made, as was standard imperial protocol, the Lair responded with genuine interest. They saw in humanity, and particularly in the Emperor's children, kindred spirits who understood the value of self-perfection. Their ambassadors spoke eloquently of cooperation, of cultural exchange, of the possibility that two races pursuing similar goals might find common ground. These overtures were transmitted to Fulgrim's flagship, carried by servitors who expected to begin the careful dance of negotiation that often preceded peaceful compliance. They could not have been more mistaken. Fulgrim rejected diplomacy outright, and his reasoning revealed something new in his character, a hardness that had not been there before. He declared humanity to be the only perfect form, the pinnacle of creation as designed by the Emperor himself. Any xeno-species, regardless of their achievements or their philosophy, was inherently inferior, inherently flawed. The Lair's pursuit of perfection was meaningless because they pursued it from a foundation of alien corruption. Only humanity, only the Emperor's vision, could achieve true perfection. The diplomats received no response to their transmissions. Instead, they received the fury of the Third Legion descending upon their world like a purple and gold avalanche. The campaign was brutal beyond even the usual standards of Xeno's extermination. The Lair fought with desperate determination, utilizing weapons that exploited sensory overload and biological warfare. Their soldiers were nightmarish things, serpentine bodies enhanced with blade limbs and toxin sacs, moving with sinuous grace through environments they had sculpted to suit their physiology. The Emperor's children met them with cold perfection, each engagement executed with the flawless precision that had become their hallmark. Cities fell, temples were razed, and the lair civilization was systematically dismantled piece by piece. Fulgrim led from the front, as was his custom, his gilded panoply splattered with alien ichor, fireblades singing through the air as it carved through lair warriors. He seemed to take a particular pleasure in the destruction, a satisfaction that went beyond the usual grim duty of Xeno's extermination. His sons noticed but said nothing, trusting in their Primarch's judgment, believing that this intensity was simply appropriate for enemies who dared claim to understand perfection. They could not see the subtle poison already working in his soul, the first hairline fractures appearing in the edifice of his character. The campaign reached its climax in the assault on the lair's greatest temple, a structure of impossible architecture that seemed to defy physical laws in its proportions and angles. Here, the lair High Magus made its final stand, surrounded by the elite of its species, defended by technologies and biological horrors that had been held in reserve for this desperate hour. The battle within the temple was chaos incarnate, a maelstrom of blade and bolt, of psychic assault and counter-assault. The Emperor's children fought their way through chamber after impossible chamber, leaving behind them a trail of alien dead. Fulgrim personally slew the lair High Magus in single combat within the temple's innermost sanctum. The alien sorcerer creature was formidable, its form enhanced beyond recognition, wielding powers that bent reality itself. It fought with techniques honed over centuries, with weapons forged in the deepest pits of its homeworld. None of it mattered. Fulgrim was a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, and his fury was terrible to behold. He moved through the Magus's attacks like smoke, finding openings that should not have existed, striking with precision that defied comprehension. When the Xenos finally fell, its body twitching in death throes, Fulgrim stood victorious amidst the ruins of its power. It was then, in that moment of triumph, that Fulgrim found the sword. It lay upon an altar of alien design, a blade of silver so pure it seemed to glow within a light. The craftsmanship was exquisite, beyond anything the lair should have been capable of creating, each line and curve perfect, the balance absolute. The weapon called to him, though he did not recognize the call for what it was. He reached out, his fingers closing around the hilt, and the moment he touched it, something fundamental changed. The demon sword had found its wielder, or perhaps its wielder had found it. In that instant, though Fulgrim did not know it, his fate was sealed. The lair campaign had yielded another prize beyond mere compliance. The Legion's tech marines had studied the sonic weaponry employed by the lair, devices that turned sound itself into a weapon capable of rupturing organs and shattering armor. They saw in these Xenos tools the potential for something greater, something that could be perfected through human ingenuity and imperial technology. The Emperor's children became pioneers of sonic weaponry, adapting and improving upon the lair designs until they surpassed the originals. Cacophony squads were formed, warriors who wielded these terrible instruments, turning the battlefield into a symphony of destruction. It seemed like innovation, like the natural evolution of their pursuit of perfection. It was, in truth, the first step towards corruption. The lair blade, as it came to be known, whispered to Fulgrim in moments of quiet. At first, the whispers were so subtle he mistook them for his own thoughts, his own insights. The sword showed him visions of futures yet to come, of glories that awaited, of perfection that transcended anything he had previously imagined. The visions were intoxicating, each one more vivid and compelling than the last. Fulgrim found himself drawn to the blade, wearing it always, even when Fireblade would have been more appropriate. He told himself it was simply appreciation for a finely crafted weapon, but the truth ran deeper, darker. Among the visions the blade showed him was one that struck Fulgrim to his core. He saw Ferrus Manus, his dearest friend, his brother in all but blood, lying dead. The vision was horrifically detailed, showing the Gorgon fallen, his head separated from his body, the light fading from his eyes. The location was unclear, the circumstances shrouded, but the fact of death was undeniable. Fulgrim tried to dismiss the vision as mere phantasm, as some trick of the warp or malfunction in his perception. Yet it haunted him, returning in dreams and quiet moments, each viewing etching itself deeper into his psyche. He did not speak of it to anyone, especially not to Ferrus, but the vision gnawed at him. Those closest to Fulgrim began to notice changes in his personality, subtle shifts that individually seemed insignificant but collectively suggested something amiss. He had always been proud, but now his pride took on an edge of arrogance that had not been there before. He had always pursued perfection, but now his standards became impossible, tyrannical, demanding not merely excellence but absolute flawlessness in every action, no matter how trivial. His temper, previously under perfect control, occasionally flared in ways that shocked those who witnessed it. When questioned about these changes, Fulgrim would deny anything was wrong, his denials delivered with such conviction that most accepted them. But a few, the most observant, began to harbor quiet doubts. It was in this altered state that Fulgrim made a decision that would have profound consequences. He authorized Fabius Bile, the Legion's chief apothecary, to begin experiments using recovered lair biological material. Bile had long pushed the boundaries of acceptable modification, always seeking to enhance the Astartes beyond their current limits, and the lair offered a treasure trove of genetic data. Fulgrim, who once would have carefully considered the implications of such research, who would have consulted with his officers and perhaps sought guidance from Terra, simply granted approval. The experiments began in secret laboratories deep within the fleet, and with them, another barrier was crossed. Fulgrim instituted perfection symposiums, gatherings where the Legion's apothecaries would dissect and analyze gene seed, seeking ways to optimize it further. These symposiums became increasingly esoteric, delving into modifications that went far beyond standard Astartes enhancement protocols. The discussions touched upon fundamental alterations to the Emperor's design, improvements that would make the Emperor's children not merely transhuman but something altogether new. Some of the apothecaries expressed quiet reservations about how far they were straying from established practice, but Fulgrim brushed aside such concerns. They were pursuing perfection, and perfection could not be constrained by outdated limitations or excessive caution. Yet for all the corruption seeping into his soul, Fulgrim's core loyalty to the Emperor remained. When he learned, through channels that remain obscure, of Horus's growing discontent with the Imperium, Fulgrim's response was immediate and unequivocal. Had the corruption not already taken root, had the lair blade not already begun its insidious work, Fulgrim would have slain Horus without hesitation. He would have seen the Warmaster's doubts as betrayal of the highest order, as a repudiation of everything the Great Crusade represented. He would have struck down even his closest brother to preserve the Emperor's vision. But that version of Fulgrim, pure and uncorrupted, no longer fully existed. When Horus finally revealed his rebellion, when the Warmaster laid bare his plans to overthrow the Emperor and reshape the Imperium according to his own vision, Fulgrim's response was not the righteous fury it should have been. Instead, he listened. The conversation took place in private, aboard Horus's flagship, with only the Warmaster and the Phoenician present. Horus spoke of the Emperor's abandonment, of his retreat to Terra and his apparent disinterest in the crusade he had begun. He spoke of the Primarch's right to rule, of humanity's need for leadership that understood the realities of galactic conquest. He painted a vision of an Imperium perfected not through blind obedience but through the strength and wisdom of those who had actually built it. And Fulgrim, tainted by the lair blade, poisoned by months of subtle corruption, found himself swayed. Not immediately, not without internal struggle, but swayed nonetheless. The arguments that should have seemed like blasphemy instead resonated with the new arrogance that had taken root in his character. Yes, the Primarchs had conquered the galaxy. Yes, they deserved more than to be cast aside once their usefulness was exhausted. Yes, perfection required that those who understood it should guide humanity's future. The logic was seductive, and Fulgrim, for all his brilliance, did not recognize it as the trap it was. What happened next would remain one of the darkest secrets of the heresy, known only to a handful of individuals. In the moment when Fulgrim committed himself to Horus's cause, when he crossed the final threshold from loyal son to traitor, something entered him. The entity that had dwelt within the lair blade, that had whispered and shown visions and gradually worn down his resistance, surged forth. Fulgrim's body became a vessel, his consciousness pushed aside, suppressed, forced to watch as a demon took control of his physical form. The possession was absolute, achieved with such subtlety that even Fulgrim himself did not immediately comprehend what had occurred. Only Horus witnessed it happen, and he said nothing, for this was part of the plan orchestrated by darker powers than even the War Master fully understood. Lorga would learn of it through his communion with the Chaos Gods, his patrons confirming what had been achieved. Magnus would sense it through his psychic gifts, recognizing the taint of the warp upon his brother but unable to act, trapped in his own struggles and compromised by his own dealings with entities beyond mortal comprehension. These three alone knew the truth, that Fulgrim, the Phoenician, the savior of Chemos, the lord of the Emperor's children, was no longer in control of his own flesh. The demon that wore Fulgrim's face was patient and cunning. It did not immediately reveal itself through dramatic changes or obvious corruption. Instead, it continued to play the role of the Primarch, attending councils, issuing orders, leading campaigns, all whilst subtly guiding the Legion down a darker path. The Emperor's children, trusting in their gene-father absolutely, followed where he led, not knowing that the being giving them orders was no longer the Primarch they revered. The perfection they had pursued so diligently was about to be twisted into something monstrous. The first crack had appeared on Laren, a hairline fracture in the edifice of Fulgrim's character. Now that crack was widening, spreading, threatening to shatter everything the Phoenician had built. The tragedy was not merely that Fulgrim had fallen, but that he had fallen whilst believing himself to be ascending to greater heights. He had reached for perfection and grasped damnation instead. And the worst part, the truly terrible truth, was that somewhere within the possessed flesh, the real Fulgrim still existed, trapped and helpless, forced to watch as his body was used to commit atrocities he would have died to prevent. The Great Crusade had changed, though few yet realized it. The heresy was coming, inevitable now, rushing towards the Imperium like a dark tide. And at its forefront would march the Emperor's children, still wearing their purple and gold, still bearing the Palatine Aquila, still believing they pursued perfection. They marched towards damnation with flags flying and victory cantatas echoing through the void, led by a Primarch who was no longer their Primarch, following a dream that had become a nightmare. The Phoenix was burning, but this time, what would rise from the ashes would be something terrible beyond imagining. Istvan, the fall of a phoenix. The Istvan system would become synonymous with betrayal, a name that would echo through the millennia as the place where the heresy truly began. 3 worlds, 3 acts of treachery, each more terrible than the last. And at the heart of it all, wearing purple and gold, stood the Emperor's children, led by a Primarch who was no longer himself, executing orders that would have once been unthinkable. The tragedy that had begun on Laren was about to detonate with apocalyptic force. Istvan III was designated for compliance, though in truth, it had already been brought into the imperial fold during the early days of the Great Crusade. The world had turned from the Emperor's light, or so the official reports claimed, falling into heresy and rebellion that demanded immediate sanction. The reality was far darker. Istvan III had remained loyal. Its crime was not rebellion but the simple fact that elements within its garrison forces had not yet been corrupted by the creeping taint that now infected the legions preparing to bombard it. Horus had given the order. Those space marines still loyal to the Emperor, those who might resist the coming betrayal, were to be deployed to the surface. They would die there, never knowing that their own brothers had condemned them. The Emperor's children committed their most steadfast warriors to the initial assault, battle brothers whose loyalty to Terra was beyond question, veterans who had served since before Fulgrim's discovery. They descended to Istvan III expecting to face heretics and traitors, prepared to bring the Emperor's justice to those who had strayed from his light. Instead, they found a population confused by accusations they did not understand, officials protesting their continued loyalty, and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The loyalist Astartes had barely begun their assessment when the sky caught fire. The virus bombs fell like rain, saturating the atmosphere of Istvan III with the Life Eater, a biological weapon so horrifically effective that it could render an entire world lifeless within hours. The pathogen was designed to consume all organic matter, turning living tissue into a corrosive soup that would further spread the contagion. When the Life Eater had run its course, the decay of so much biomass would create firestorms that would scour the planet clean. It was genocide on a planetary scale, and it was deployed not against enemies of the Imperium but against the Emperor's own warriors. The loyalist Emperor's children on the surface had only moments to comprehend what was happening before the virus took them. But the virus bombing was not perfectly executed. Some of the Astartes, protected by sealed armor or fortunate enough to reach shelter in time, survived the initial assault. What should have been a quick extermination became a protracted ground war as these survivors, now fully aware of the betrayal, dug in and prepared to sell their lives dearly. The traitor legions, including the corrupted majority of the Emperor's children, were forced to deploy to the surface to root out the remaining loyalists. The combat that followed was brutal and personal, brother fighting brother in the ruins of a world that had died screaming. Fulgrim, or rather the demon wearing his face, observed the struggle with cold calculation. The ground war was dragging on longer than anticipated, and prolonged combat risked giving the loyalists opportunities to transmit warnings to Terra or nearby compliant forces. Something was needed to break their morale, to crush the spirit that kept them fighting against impossible odds. The solution was as cruel as it was effective. The traitors began broadcasting manipulated Vox transmissions, messages that appeared to come from Terra itself, from the Emperor himself, declaring the defenders of Istvan III to be traitors and heretics, ordering their extermination. The psychological impact was devastating. These were warriors who had built their entire existence around loyalty to the Emperor, and now they heard his voice, or what seemed to be his voice, condemning them. Many lost the will to fight. Some took their own lives rather than die branded as traitors. The resistance crumbled. It was during the Istvan III campaign that the Emperor's children created the first paying gladiators, a horrific innovation that would become emblematic of their descent into Slaneshi worship. Loyalist prisoners were subjected to extensive modification and conditioning, transformed into living weapons whose nervous systems had been rewired to convert pain into euphoria. These wretched souls were set against each other in arenas erected amidst the ruins, fighting to the death whilst the traitor Astartes watched and cheered. The paying gladiators served multiple purposes. They disposed of prisoners, provided entertainment, and demonstrated to any wavering members of the Legion just how far they had strayed from their former principles. Those who watched and felt revulsion learned to hide it. Those who watched and felt excitement learned to embrace it. Between the atrocities of Istvan III and the massacre that would come at Istvan V, there was a moment of terrible celebration. Aboard the flagship of the Emperor's children, Fulgrim hosted what would be remembered as the Maraviglia, though those initial syllables would acquire a far darker meaning than mere marvel. It was described as an orbital celebration, but such words fail to capture the true nature of the event. The Maraviglia was a descent into absolute debauchery, a festival of excess that pushed every boundary of sensation and experience. Remembrancers performed works of such disturbing content that several observers were driven mad by witnessing them. The sounds, the sights, the very atmosphere of the celebration was saturated with corruption. Mortals and Astartes alike partook in experiences that would have been unthinkable mere months before. The pursuit of perfection had become the pursuit of sensation, and sensation had become an end unto itself, divorced from any higher purpose or meaning. What began as artistic performances devolved into orgies of violence and pleasure intertwined. The ship's corridors ran with blood and other fluids, the air thick with screams that were indistinguishable as agony or ecstasy. The Maraviglia lasted for days, and when it finally concluded, the Emperor's children who emerged were fundamentally changed. They had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. During the Maraviglia, something subtle but significant occurred. The Legion's battle cry, which had once been a declaration of their pursuit of perfection and their loyalty to the Emperor, began to mutate. The words shifted, acquiring new inflections, new meanings. Where once they had shouted oaths of honor, they now screamed pledges of sensation and excess. The change was organic, emerging from the collective consciousness of the corrupted legion rather than imposed by command. It reflected the truth that the Emperor's children were becoming something new, something that retained only the shell of what they had been. It was also during this period that the culture of the Noise Marines truly began to coalesce. The sonic weaponry that had been adopted after Laren was becoming more than mere tools of war. The Cacophony and their successors discovered that the sounds of battle, the screams of the dying, the roar of explosions, could all be orchestrated into something approaching music. They began to seek out specific tones, specific frequencies that induced particular sensations. Combat became performance art, each battle a symphony composed in real time with the sounds of death and suffering. The Noise Marines would become one of the most distinctive and feared elements of the corrupted legion, their weapons capable of liquefying flesh and shattering ceramite whilst producing sounds that were as seductive as they were lethal. Then came Istvan V, the drop site massacre, and with it the final, irrevocable fall of the Emperor's children. 7 legions descended to the surface, 4 ostensibly loyal and 3 openly traitor, though the truth was that 7 traitor legions had coordinated one of the most devastating ambushes in Imperial history. The loyalist Primarchs, Ferrus Manus, Corax, and Vulcan, led their sons into what they believed would be a righteous battle to punish the traitors of Istvan III. Instead, they walked into annihilation. Fulgrim commanded the Emperor's Children contingent with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made him a legend. He personally oversaw the digging of perfect trench lines, defensive positions that were geometrically ideal, their angles calculated to provide maximum fields of fire whilst offering optimal protection. Even in betrayal, even corrupted by demonic possession, the Primarch's obsession with perfection manifested. The trenches were works of art, beautiful in their lethality, a demonstration that Fulgrim's martial genius remained intact even as his soul rotted. After the initial stages of the massacre, when the betrayal had been revealed and the Loyalist legions were in full retreat, the Emperor's Children captured the Iron Hand's flagship. This vessel, a proud ship that had carried Ferrus Manus's sons across the stars for decades, was subjected to a desecration so profound it bordered on the metaphysical. Fulgrim ordered it transformed into a pleasure barge, its sacred spaces converted into chambers of excess and torment. The ship's chapel became a torture amphitheater. Its armories were filled with instruments of pain masquerading as art. Its corridors were decorated with living sculptures, captured iron hands suspended in fields that kept them alive and aware whilst their bodies were slowly transformed into grotesque displays. It was a deliberate insult to Ferrus, a mockery of everything the Iron Hands represented. Fulgrim's inner circle, once the Phoenix Guard, had evolved into something far more sinister. They now called themselves the Phoenician Guard, a subtle change that reflected their absolute devotion to their Primarch rather than to the ideals he once embodied. These warriors were the most corrupted of the Emperor's children, having embraced every excess, every modification, every dark gift offered by their new patron. They wore armor that had been extensively modified, adorned with symbols that would have been recognized by any scholar of the warp as marks of Slaanesh. The Phoenician Guard wielded mirrored halberds, weapons whose blades had been polished to perfect reflectivity. These were not mere affectations of vanity but psychological weapons. An opponent facing the Guard would see themselves reflected in the blades, would be forced to confront their own image even as they fought for their lives. The mirrors also served a more esoteric purpose, reflecting not merely physical forms but souls, revealing truths that mortal minds were not meant to perceive. Many foes died not from the blades themselves but from the revelations the mirrors forced upon them. In the chaos of the drop site massacre, as the Iron Hands were broken and scattered, Fulgrim made a decision that revealed the complexity of his corruption. He secretly spared several Iron Hands captains, warriors who had fought with particular distinction, whose loyalty to Ferrus was absolute. These were not acts of mercy but something far more cruel. The captains were taken alive, brought aboard the corrupted flagship, and subjected to weeks of careful, methodical breaking. They were exposed to every sensation, every experience, every temptation that Slaanesh could offer through mortal intermediaries. The process was designed not to kill but to addict and corrupt. The Iron Hands captains, known for their stoicism and their resistance to weakness, were systematically dismantled as individuals. Their certainties were eroded, their faith undermined, their sense of self gradually dissolved in a flood of overwhelming sensation. When Fulgrim finally deemed the process complete, he released them. These broken warriors were returned to the scattered remnants of their legion, alive but fundamentally destroyed. They carried with them the taint of corruption, the seed of doubt and desire that would spread amongst their brothers. It was psychological warfare elevated to an art form, and it was utterly without honor. But all of this, all the atrocities and corruptions, paled before the central act of the drop site massacre, the moment that would define Fulgrim's fall and haunt the Imperium for 10,000 years. Amidst the carnage, amidst the betrayal and the slaughter, Fulgrim found Ferrus Manus. His dearest friend, his brother in all but blood, the one Primarch with whom he had shared a bond of true understanding and affection. They faced each other across a field of dead, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The duel between Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus was brutal and personal in ways that no chronicle could fully capture. These were not merely warriors fighting, but brothers whose friendship had been legendary, whose bond had seemed unbreakable. Ferrus fought with the rage of absolute betrayal, his silver hands crushing traitor Astartes as he carved a path towards Fulgrim, his thunder hammer swinging with murderous intent. Fulgrim met him with the lair blade in hand, the demon sword that had orchestrated this very moment, and with techniques perfected over decades of brotherhood now turned to fratricide. They were evenly matched in ways that few Primarch duels ever achieved. Ferrus's raw strength against Fulgrim's preternatural speed. The Gorgon's implacable determination against the Phoenician's perfect technique. The combat was a masterclass in Primarch warfare, each blow capable of killing a lesser being, each parry executed with precision that defied mortal comprehension. The ground beneath them cracked under the force of their impacts. The air itself seemed to scream. But Fulgrim had advantages that went beyond martial skill. The demon that possessed him lent strength and insight, showing him openings before they appeared, guiding his blade with supernatural precision. More importantly, Ferrus was fighting his friend, and some part of him, even in rage and betrayal, hesitated. Fulgrim felt no such compunction. The demon knew only the imperative to kill, to complete the act that would seal Fulgrim's damnation beyond any possibility of redemption. The killing blow came with terrible irony. Fulgrim wielded not the lair blade but Forge Breaker, the thunder hammer that Ferrus himself had crafted and gifted to his brother. The weapon that had been a symbol of their friendship became the instrument of Ferrus's death. Fulgrim's swing was perfect, the arc geometrically ideal, the force precisely calculated. Forgebreaker struck Ferrus Manus at the neck, and the Gorgon's head separated from his body. The Primarch, who had seemed invincible, whose strength had been legendary even amongst his superhuman brothers, fell. His silver hands twitched once and were still. For a moment, as Ferrus's head tumbled through the air, the demon's control slipped. The real Fulgrim, the consciousness that had been suppressed and imprisoned within his own flesh, surged forth. He looked down at what he had done, at the body of his dearest friend lying broken at his feet, at the blood on the hammer he had once treasured above all gifts. The enormity of the act crashed down upon him like a physical weight. This was not perfection. This was not glory. This was fratricide, the ultimate betrayal, the murder of the one person in all the galaxy who had truly understood him. Remorse flooded through Fulgrim with overwhelming force. The true Primarch, freed for these brief moments, attempted repentance even there on the blood-soaked battlefield. He fell to his knees beside Ferrus's corpse, Forgebreaker slipping from nerveless fingers. He reached out towards his brother's face, frozen in an expression of shock and betrayal, and words tumbled from his lips, apologies and pleas for forgiveness that would never be heard. For those few heartbeats, the Phoenician was himself again, confronting the full horror of what the demon had made him do, what he had allowed to be done through his weakness and pride. The demon could not permit such weakness to persist. It surged back with redoubled force, re-enslaving Fulgrim's consciousness with chains stronger than before. The Primarch's moment of clarity and remorse was crushed beneath the demon's overwhelming will. Fulgrim was dragged back down into the prison of his own mind, locked away where he could only watch, only bear witness to the atrocities committed in his name. The demon rose from beside Ferrus's corpse, the moment of weakness past, ready to continue the massacre as though nothing had occurred. But something had changed in that moment of remorse and re-enslavement. Some fundamental aspect of Fulgrim's consciousness had been altered by the experience of killing Ferrus, by confronting what he had become. In the strange landscape of his imprisoned mind, Fulgrim made a decision. He could not free himself, could not regain control of his body, but perhaps he could imprison his captor. With an effort of will that would have been impossible for any being less than a Primarch, Fulgrim turned the tables on the demon that possessed him. He imprisoned it within himself, creating a cage within a cage, trapping the entity that had trapped him. The victory was Pyrrhic at best. Fulgrim regained control of his physical form, but he was irrevocably changed by the demon's influence and by the act of murdering Ferrus. The Primarch who emerged from this internal struggle was neither fully the demon nor fully the original Fulgrim. He was something new, something that contained elements of both, a fusion of Primarch and demonic corruption that would prove more terrible than either alone. In the aftermath of the imprisonment, standing amidst the carnage of the drop site massacre with his brother's blood on his hands, Fulgrim made his final choice. He could have sought redemption, could have turned Forgebreaker upon himself and ended the nightmare. He could have attempted to warn the Emperor, to expose the full extent of Horus's rebellion. But he did not. Instead, exhausted by the internal struggle, horrified by what he had done but unable to undo it, Fulgrim fully embraced Slaanesh. He acknowledged the Dark Prince as his patron, accepted the gifts and the corruption, and committed himself utterly to the service of the chaos god of excess and sensation. The embrace was conscious and deliberate in ways his initial fall had not been. This was not gradual corruption or demonic possession overriding his will. This was Fulgrim, the Phoenician, the savior of Chemos, choosing damnation with full knowledge of what he was doing. Perhaps he believed that in serving Slaanesh he could achieve the perfection he had always sought. Perhaps he was simply too far gone to conceive of any other path. Or perhaps, broken by the murder of Ferrus and the struggle with the demon, he no longer cared about redemption or consequences. The phoenix had fallen, and what rose from the ashes was a monster wearing a hero's face. The Emperor's children followed their Primarch into the depths of corruption, their pursuit of perfection transformed into an insatiable hunger for sensation and excess. The warrior artists who had once embodied the highest ideals of the Great Crusade had become heralds of damnation, and at their head marched Fulgrim, forever damned, forever seeking a perfection that would always elude him because he now sought it in all the wrong places. The tragedy was complete. The fall was absolute, and the heresy raged on. The Serpent of Slaanesh. In the twisted realm beyond reality, where the warp bleeds into the materium and the laws of physics bow before the whims of dark gods, Fulgrim underwent his final transformation. The ascension was both reward and punishment, gift and curse, the ultimate expression of everything he had become and everything he had lost. He rose as a demon prince of Slaanesh, but the form he took was far removed from the perfect human physique he had once possessed. Where there had been a Primarch of unsurpassed beauty, there now existed a serpentine monstrosity, a creature with 4 arms ending in taloned hands, its lower body that of an enormous serpent covered in iridescent scales that shifted through colors no mortal eye was meant to perceive. This was perfection as Slaanesh understood it, beauty so extreme it became horror, sensation so intense it destroyed comprehension. The transformation was irreversible and absolute. Fulgrim had transcended mortality, becoming something that existed partially outside normal space and time, a being of such power that his mere presence could drive mortals to madness or ecstasy or both simultaneously. Yet in achieving this apotheosis, he had lost the last vestiges of what had made him Fulgrim the Phoenician. The demon prince that bore his name and wore his memories was as much a monument to his fall as a continuation of his existence. Fulgrim established his seat of power on Kallax, a world that existed within the Eye of Terror, that great wound in reality where the warp spilled into the galaxy. Kallax had been a civilized world once, before the heresy, before the Eye's formation had swallowed it whole. Now it was something else entirely, reshaped by Fulgrim's will and Slaanesh's power into a realm that defied description. The planet's very substance had been transformed, its mountains sculpted into impossible geometries, its seas turned to liquids that existed in states between solid, liquid, and gas, its atmosphere saturated with psychoactive compounds that induced visions in any who breathed them. Upon this world of madness, Fulgrim created the Maze Gardens, structures that extended across vast territories and served as both his palace and his personal work of art. The gardens were not merely physical spaces but conceptual ones, designed to overwhelm and transform anyone who entered them. Each pathway led through chambers of different sensory experiences, some pleasurable beyond endurance, others agonizing beyond death, most combining both in ways that shattered the distinction between pain and pleasure. Time flowed strangely within the Maze Gardens, hours passing as seconds or seconds stretching into subjective years. Mortals who entered rarely emerged, and those who did were invariably changed beyond recognition, either broken completely or transformed into devoted servants of excess. At the heart of the Maze Garden stood the Gallery of Agonies, Fulgrim's personal collection of suffering elevated to art. Here were displayed the results of 10,000 years of experimentation with pain and pleasure, sensation and experience. Living beings, some mortal and some transhuman, were suspended in fields that kept them perpetually aware whilst their bodies were slowly transformed into sculptures of torment and ecstasy. Each display represented a different exploration of the limits of sensation, a different answer to the question of how much a conscious being could experience before the self dissolved entirely. Fulgrim would spend centuries in this gallery, studying his works, making minute adjustments, seeking always the perfect balance that would create the ultimate expression of Slaanesh's dominion. Among the most disturbing features of Fulgrim's domain were the echo sculptures, constructs that existed simultaneously as physical objects and as psychic phenomena. These sculptures were crafted from the crystallized screams and moans of Fulgrim's victims, sounds given physical form through sorcery and bound into shapes that resonated with anyone who perceived them. To see an echo sculpture was to hear it was to feel it, and to feel it was to experience a fragment of every sensation that had gone into its creation. Some sculptures embodied the death agonies of slaughtered populations. Others contained the ecstatic raptures of willing devotees. The most prized pieces combined both, creating feedback loops of experience that could trap an unwary mind for eternity. Fulgrim instituted perfection tournaments, grand competitions where diamonds, mortal champions, and corrupted Astartes would compete to demonstrate their mastery of various arts. But these were not tournaments as the Imperium would understand them. Combat was judged not merely on effectiveness but on aesthetic quality. Poets competed to craft verses so beautiful or so terrible that listeners would weep blood. Musicians performed pieces that could shatter adamantium or heal mortal wounds depending on the note struck. Sculptors worked with living flesh, creating masterpieces that screamed and laughed and begged. The winners of these tournaments were granted boons by Fulgrim himself, whilst the losers often became materials for the next competition's artists to work with. Fulgrim's demon form secreted a euphoric venom, a substance that wept from his transformed flesh and could induce states of overwhelming pleasure in any who contacted it. Even a single drop was enough to addict a mortal utterly, creating a dependency so powerful that death seemed preferable to existence without it. The venom served multiple purposes. It was a weapon, paralyzing enemies with sensation so intense they could no longer distinguish between self and environment. It was a tool of corruption, turning the strongest-willed servants of the Imperium into slavering addicts with a single application. And it was, in its own twisted way, a gift that Fulgrim bestowed upon those he favored, a substance that allowed them to transcend the limitations of unenhanced perception and experience reality as he experienced it, in all its terrible intensity. The pleasure barge culture that had begun aboard the corrupted fleet during the heresy spread throughout the Emperor's children's domain. Entire fleets of vessels, some dating back to the Great Crusade and others constructed in the twisted shipyards of the Eye, were converted into floating temples of excess. These ships drifted through the warp and occasionally emerged into real space, descending upon unsuspecting worlds to gather slaves, resources, and new experiences. Life aboard a pleasure barge was an endless cycle of sensation-seeking, each crew member engaged in a personal quest to experience things no one had experienced before, to push boundaries that had never been approached. The barges became infamous across the Imperium, their arrival heralded by psychic disturbances and the sudden onset of mass hysteria amongst planetary populations. As the millennia passed and the Imperium entered its 41st millennium, Fulgrim engaged in acts of cultural warfare that would bear fruit across the galaxy. He seeded noise marine relics throughout the Materium, ancient weapons and armor pieces from the heresy era, planted in locations where they would be discovered by imperial forces, ambitious nobles, or curious archaeologists. These relics were more than mere equipment. They carried fragments of the corruption that had consumed their original bearers, psychic imprints that could influence anyone who handled them. A governor who discovered a noise marine sonic weapon might become obsessed with sound, gradually transforming his court into a den of increasingly extreme musical experimentation that would eventually attract the attention of Slaanesh. A space marine chapter that recovered armor from a fallen emperor's child might find their battle brothers slowly adopting practices that mimicked those of the ancient traitors. Fulgrim maintained a shadow court of enthralled nobles, mortals drawn from across the galaxy who had been captured, corrupted, or who had willingly sought out the demon Primarch's patronage. These nobles came from every level of imperial society. There were planetary governors who had grown bored with mere political power and sought more exotic experiences. There were rogue traders who had ventured too far into the Eye and found themselves unable to leave. There were scions of ancient bloodlines who had discovered forbidden texts and become obsessed with the aesthetics of corruption. Fulgrim used this shadow court as both entertainment and intelligence network, gathering information about the Imperium whilst amusing himself with the intrigues and excesses of mortals who believed themselves sophisticated but were merely damned. In an act that sent shockwaves through both the Materium and the Warp, Fulgrim destroyed the Crone Swords, ancient Eldar artifacts that held significance in that dying race's mythology. The Crone Swords were weapons of immense power, forged in ages past and scattered across the galaxy after the fall that had given birth to Slaanesh. The Eldar believed that gathering all the swords would allow them to confront Slaanesh directly, perhaps even to slay the Dark Prince and free the souls of their people from eternal torment. Fulgrim, whether acting on his own initiative or at Slaanesh's direction, hunted down several of these legendary blades and shattered them, reducing artifacts that had survived for millions of years to worthless fragments. It was an act of spite that crushed Eldar hopes and demonstrated that even their oldest legends could not save them from the consequences of their ancestors' excesses. To Lucius the Eternal, the champion who had become the embodiment of Slaaneshi arrogance and skill in combat, Fulgrim gifted a shard of the Lair Blade, the demon sword that had begun his own corruption. The shard was small, no larger than a finger, but it retained all the malevolent intelligence and corrupting influence of the original weapon. Lucius incorporated the shard into his own armor, allowing it to whisper to him as it had once whispered to Fulgrim, showing him visions of perfect combat, of duels yet to come, of sensations that could only be achieved through the most exquisite violence. The gift was typical of Fulgrim's relationship with his favored champions, simultaneously a blessing and a curse, empowering them whilst ensuring they remained bound to the same dark path he walked. In the closing years of the 41st millennium, Fulgrim suffered a wound that cut deeper than any physical injury could. Ancient Rylanor, a dreadnought of the Emperor's children who had remained loyal during the heresy, had survived for 10,000 years on the world of Istvan III, waiting in the ruins for a chance at vengeance. When Fulgrim finally returned to that cursed world, drawn by pride and curiosity, Rylanor detonated a virus bomb he had carefully preserved since the heresy. The explosion did little physical damage to a demon Primarch, but Rylanor's words, his absolute refusal to be corrupted or swayed despite millennia of isolation, his declaration that Fulgrim was a traitor and a failure, these wounded the Primarch's pride in ways that weapons never could. For a demon prince whose entire existence was built upon the pursuit of perfection and the demonstration of superiority, to be rejected so utterly by one of his own sons was agony of a sort that no amount of physical sensation could match. Rumors persisted, whispered through the shadowy networks of information that connected the Imperium's underworld, of Fulgrim maintaining a hidden pleasure world somewhere outside the Eye of Terror. This world, if it existed, was said to be where the demon Primarch retreated when even the Maze Gardens and the Gallery of Agonies could no longer satisfy his jaded senses. Here, the rumors claimed, Fulgrim pursued experiences so extreme, so far beyond normal comprehension, that even other demon princes of Slaanesh found them excessive. The existence of this world had never been confirmed, but the rumors themselves served a purpose, creating a legend of excesses beyond excess, a myth that both attracted and repelled in equal measure. Fabius Bile, the ancient apothecary who had served Fulgrim since before the heresy and who had continued his experiments across the millennia, made a claim that sent ripples through the fragmented remnants of the Emperor's children. He announced that he had created a perfect clone of the original Fulgrim, a genetic copy that contained all the Primarch's potential without any of the corruption that had consumed the original. Bile claimed that this clone represented what Fulgrim could have been, what he should have been, had pride and the Lair Blade not led him astray. Whether the clone actually existed, whether it was truly perfect, and what Bile intended to do with it remained mysteries. But the mere possibility that somewhere in the galaxy there existed a version of Fulgrim uncorrupted and pure was a cruel joke that the demon Primarch himself might have appreciated. Fulgrim sent forth perfection emissaries, diamonds, and corrupted mortals who carried his message to hive worlds across the Imperium. These emissaries did not arrive with armies or open displays of demonic power. Instead, they came as artists, philosophers, and aesthetes, offering to teach the hive nobility how to refine their senses, how to experience life more fully, how to achieve perfection in all things. They established salons and galleries, performance spaces and workshops, gradually building networks of influence within the upper echelons of hive society. By the time planetary authorities realized what was happening, entire noble houses would be corrupted, their members so far down the path of excess that they could no longer conceive of returning to their former lives. Hive worlds that had stood loyal for millennia would tear themselves apart in orgies of violence and sensation, all because the perfection emissaries had shown their ruling class a glimpse of experiences beyond the mundane. Despite his ascension to demonhood, or perhaps because of it, Fulgrim found himself drawn into the politics of the warp. He mediated between Slaaneshi warbands, settling disputes over territory and tribute, arbitrating matters of honor and precedence amongst champions who would otherwise have destroyed each other and wasted resources that could be better spent corrupting the Imperium. This was not altruism but pragmatism. A unified front of Slaaneshi forces was more effective than scattered warbands pursuing individual agendas. Moreover, the role of mediator allowed Fulgrim to maintain influence over a network of followers that extended far beyond his own immediate forces, creating a web of obligation and favor that made him one of the most powerful servants of the Dark Prince. Yet for all his power, for all his achievements and atrocities, Fulgrim remained fundamentally unsatisfied. The demon Primarch was caught in eternal excess, forever chasing a perfection that retreated before him like a mirage. Each new sensation, no matter how extreme, eventually became familiar and therefore insufficient. Each work of art, no matter how exquisite or terrible, eventually failed to move him as it once had. He was condemned by his own nature and by Slaanesha's curse to pursue an ideal that could never be achieved because the very act of achieving it would render it mundane. In the cold watches between raids and celebrations, when the maze gardens fell silent and even the Gallery of Agonies ceased its endless chorus of suffering, Fulgrim would sometimes remember Chemos. He would recall the satisfaction of seeing vapor extractors functioning at optimal efficiency, the pride of watching Chemosians perform in theaters lit by orbital mirrors, the simple joy of sculpting portraits of his adoptive parents. Those memories, preserved perfectly in a mind that forgot nothing, were perhaps the greatest torment of all. They showed him what he had been, what he had lost, what he had destroyed in pursuit of a perfection that had proven to be damnation in disguise. The Phoenician had risen from failure, just as the name implied. But he had risen too high, reached too far, and in grasping for godhood had lost his humanity entirely. The phoenix had burned, and what emerged from the ashes was a serpent, beautiful and terrible, forever hungry and never satisfied. 10,000 years had passed since Istvan, since the murder of Ferrus Manus, since the choice that had damned him. 10,000 years of excess and sensation, of corruption and conquest, of seeking perfection in all the wrong places. And still Fulgrim searched, still he pursued, still he believed that somewhere, somehow, true perfection could be achieved. It was the final joke, the ultimate torture, that the demon Primarch who had everything, was the one being in the universe who could never be content with what he had. The serpent of Slaanesh coiled in the eye of terror, master of pleasures beyond mortal comprehension, and dreamed impossible dreams of a perfection that would always elude his grasp. Fulgrim once rebuilt a dying world into a paradise of art and industry. Now he reshapes entire systems into monuments of excess. The Phoenician still rises from failure. But now, he rises as a serpent.